You're seeing all this loss around you. These are businesses that have been gearing up to open tomorrow, but we're instead cleaning up debris, sweeping broken glass, and trying to tally the inventory that had been stolen from them. And also, of course, contacting insurance companies. It was hard to see, hard to take in, painful.
NBC News Now correspondent Dasha Burns joining me now from Chicago. Dasha, we heard the mayor talking about what it's been like over the past few days, what's going on in Chicago. What is it like there right now?
Hey, Allison, well, we're actually in the middle of a protest that started 2 p.m. Chicago time here. We've been walking over 2 miles now. It started at Wrigley Field, home to the famous Chicago Cubs. And we don't know exact crowd estimates, but it seems to me about a couple thousand people here. It is 91 degrees today in Chicago, but folks are out here. They're peaceful. They're handing out water. You can see over here, there's someone handing out water, some sunscreen, snacks. It has been a very much a community feel here. And as much as you heard the mayor talk about how heartbroken she was to see the looting and some of the vandalism, she also talked about at that press conference about how she saw communities come together, helping businesses clean up, community members and businesses working together, about a lot of neighborly acts. And that's something that we've definitely seen here today, Allison, on this very hot Chicago day.
Yeah, it tends to get pretty hot pretty quickly as soon as spring turns into summertime in Chicago, Dasha. That's a fast change in that area. Let me ask you about the National Guard. We have been seeing their presence in cities and states throughout the country. What role are they playing there in Chicago, if any?
Yeah, well, we've seen the National Guard step up the numbers. Over the weekend, there were just over 300 National Guard troops deployed to the city. Now we're at over 600. And the police presence, especially in downtown, I'm just going to get out of the way of the cars here. We're at the back line of the protest. The police presence in downtown in the city center is heavy. The National Guard presence is heavy there. The bridges are closed. It's very hard to move in and out of the city. But in this protest here today, we've seen police officers, but it has not been nearly as big a presence as we see downtown right now, where actually this march is headed right now.
Dasha, I don't want to forget about the coronavirus, of course. Today, Mayor Lightfoot announced phase 3 of Chicago's reopening plan will continue this week. What do you know about that decision? And is there a concern that these large crowds of protesters could potentially cause a second wave of the outbreak?
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at the folks coming by here, if you swing the camera around, they've got their signs, they're protesting, but they all have their masks on. We have seen masks on the majority of the crowd here. Certainly a reminder that this pandemic is not over. But public health officials are concerned that events like these could be super spreader events. Potentially, and we'll have to see what happens in the coming weeks as a result of these big events. But, Allison, tomorrow, the city is planning to reopen. The mayor said she talked to a lot of small business owners, local officials, Chamber of Commerce. She asked, should we delay reopening because of all of this? And they said overwhelmingly no. They wanted to press forward with reopening. So many of these businesses so hard hit by the coronavirus. And so they want to move forward. So tomorrow we'll see restaurants begin to reopen, coffee shops, hair salons, barber shops, non-essential retail stores. All the while, Chicago's numbers are climbing. They're nearing 50,000 cases now, 1,000 people hospitalized in the city. And meanwhile, we're seeing crowds of thousands of people. So how that cocktail comes together in the next couple of weeks, we'll just have to see, Allison.
Yeah, Dasha, it will be interesting to see what that means for so many cities in the next few weeks. Dasha Burns, thank you so much. Stay safe and stay cool. I know it's hot out there.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.